Hello friends, this is Grief speaking. Today we're looking at tier 4 of the horror movie villains Iceberg, and this tier alone has around 50 plus entries. We're also getting into some more obscure stuff here, even for me, and there's some really cool finds on this one, so let's just get into it. This is the horror movie villains Iceberg, tier 4. Starting with Chop Top Sawyer, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Robert Sawyer, or Chop Top, is one of the main antagonists of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, along with Leatherface, his brother. During the events of the first film, Chop Top was actually an infantry soldier in Vietnam. However, he was sliced in the head by a machete and managed to survive, although a metal plate was grafted onto his skull. From there, he rejoined the family, assisting in all of their seedy activities. Chop Top definitely steals the show in this film, mostly because he's such an insane character and a major part of the dark comedy here. He talks in a really weird and erratic way, constantly smiling. He also wears wigs in order to cover up the metal plate on his head, which has become exposed. This is due to the fact that he constantly carries around a metal hanger, which he heats up with a lighter and uses to pick at the skin around the plate. Worse than that, he actually takes the skin he picks off and eats it. Gross. This notable performance comes from none other than Bill Moseley, who we mentioned last tier for his performance of Otis Driftwood in Rob Zombie's Firefly trilogy. The Werewolf, an American Werewolf in London. It's actually unclear to me whether this entry is referring to the original werewolf that infects the main character David near the beginning of the film, or if it's meaning David himself, who becomes the werewolf that we see more prominently. I also feel like this should probably be higher up on the Berg, but whatever, let's just get into it. So the original werewolf that attacks David and his friend Jack is only seen briefly, and the only good look we actually get is his human form as he's killed and reverts back to a man. David in werewolf form we see much more throughout the film, and there's not much more to say about it other than of course mentioning that this movie is kind of the GOAT when it comes to werewolf transformation scenes. There's also some interesting lore here as well. David's friend Jack, who was killed by the werewolf, doesn't fully die. He becomes undead and continues to talk with David throughout the movie, being forced to walk between life and death until the werewolf's bloodline is ended. That's kind of an interesting angle that I hadn't seen in a werewolf movie before. Dr. Giggles. Evan Rendell Jr., aka Dr. Giggles, is a homicidal maniac who begins killing the residents of Moore High, disguised as a doctor. Well, the backstory here is that Evan's mother died due to a heart condition of some kind when he was a kid, and his father went mad, killing residents of Moore High and ripping out their hearts to try and resurrect his dead wife. Eventually, the deaths were traced back to Dr. Rendell and he was killed by the police, but Evan Jr. escaped, never to be seen again, until now. 30 years later, he escapes a mental asylum where he's only known as Dr. Giggles because of his disturbing laughter. He returns to Moore High to continue where his father left off, becoming obsessed with a teenage girl who has a heart condition similar to his mother's. He makes a really fun villain because every kill is basically an excuse for some kind of pun.
He should have kept his hands to himself.
He uses all kinds of medical devices to kill his victims, and it's usually accompanied by some kind of one-liner, and of course his creepy giggles. It's cheesy and hasn't aged all that well, but it's entertaining, and I'll give it credit, there are actually a lot of kills, giving Dr. Giggles plenty of screen time, which can be rare for a slasher villain. Sebastian Caine, Hollow Man. We covered the Invisible Man back on tier 2. Well, Hollow Man is a much darker adaptation of the original novel by H.G. Wells, while still carrying the same general theme. The film follows Sebastian Caine, a scientist working for the Pentagon to formulate a serum that can turn living beings invisible. After successfully turning a gorilla invisible and then visible again, Caine and his team are ready to report their progress to the Pentagon, but Caine lies, asking for an extension for the project, keeping them from taking over the program. Caine then convinces his team to continue on to human trials without permission and uses himself as the subject. From this point on, much like Jack Griffin, the serum seems to slowly work Caine into madness as he becomes more aggressive and immature. He initially starts by simply pranking the team, but eventually fondles one of them in her sleep. And I wish I could say that was the least of Caine's sexual deviance, but it gets much worse. After being stuck in the lab for 10 days, he escapes to go to his own apartment. When he sees his neighbor undressing, he sneaks into her apartment and has his way with her, realizing he can get away with it completely and seems to have no remorse after the fact. He goes back to the lab and continues his sketchy activity and behavior with the team. Finally, some of the team members decide to tell their higher up, as it seems Caine's behavior is getting out of hand. Caine kills the head of the committee and plans on killing everyone else on the team as well. This is where it just goes full slasher, with Caine slowly picking off the team as they attempt to finish the serum to make him visible again. The effects are pretty cool for the time, and an invisible killer is always a great concept. The puppets, Puppet Master. This is a huge series, and like any long-running horror franchise, there are a lot of changes and retcons to the lore, but I'll focus mostly on the first film for the sake of simplicity. The puppets were originally crafted by puppeteer Andre Toulon. Andre, whose wife was killed by Nazis, discovers an ancient Egyptian method of reanimating his figures, which he plans to use for revenge. The puppets are used for various purposes throughout the series, but they're actually not downright evil, and in the first film, they're just trying to protect the secrets of their reanimation from humans who want to use it to become immortal. The most recognizable is probably Blade, who has a hook and knife for hands. There's also Jester, the clown-like doll, Pinhead, who might be my favorite because he looks hilarious with massive muscular arms and a tiny head, Tunneler is a puppet with a large drill on its head, and probably the creepiest is Leech Woman, who looks like she's straight out of the disturbing manga Iceberg. She can regurgitate leeches that suck the blood of her victims. There's been more puppets that have joined along the way as well, and I find the puppet design to be the best part of the series. Syl. Species. Syl is an alien-human hybrid created by the US government. The SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence program, actually comes into contact with an alien life form that sends two messages. One containing a method of creating an infinite fuel supply, and secondly, an alien DNA sequence that can be combined with that of humans to produce a hybrid. After several failed attempts, Syl is born. She appears as a normal human girl, although she ages rapidly, appearing like a 12-year-old after only 3 months. After some violent outbursts, the scientists, led by Dr. Xavier Fitch, decides she's too risky and prepare to kill her, but she escapes the lab. A special team is then configured in order to track her down and take her out. After rapidly aging again, Syl is now an adult female and begins seeking out a mate in order to propagate the species. She has superhuman strength, a massive projectile tongue, and rapid healing. While most of the film we see Syl in her human form, she can morph into an alien monstrosity, especially when pregnant and protecting her offspring. While some of the effects are outdated, making the alien form look cheesy at times, the design is pretty cool and was done by H.R. Geiger, who famously designed the xenomorphs from Alien. The Man. Hush. Hush is a 2016 horror film where the whole gimmick is that a deaf and mute woman is being stalked by a killer. Maddie, the deaf-mute horror writer, moves out of the city to live in the isolated woods to hopefully write a new book. However, a man in a mask shows up, kills her friend, and begins stalking her. Honestly, the man is a complete enigma. We never learn his true identity or his motivation for killing. However, he does use a crossbow as his primary weapon and has been keeping track of his kills by carving notches into the bow, 13 at this point. He's clearly sadistic and enjoys toying with his victims, giving up several opportunities to easily kill Maddie to instead mess with her first. Killer Klowns. Killer Klowns from Outer Space. Another entry that should probably be a little higher up on the iceberg, especially with the new game that just released. The Killer Klowns are pretty self-explanatory. Arriving in a spaceship that looks like a big top, these grotesque aliens begin hunting down humans so that they can encase them in cotton candy-like cocoons that turn them into a bloody goo, which the aliens drink with a straw. It's wacky, over-the-top fun with all kinds of goofy kills and scenarios. Also, the makeup effects are great, and although the film overall is a comedy, those killer clown faces definitely scared the snot out of me as a kid. Billy, Black Christmas. Black Christmas is considered one of the earliest slasher films, and I guess that makes the villain Billy one of the earliest slashers. The film takes place around Christmas when a group of girls in a sorority house start being stalked and killed. The killer, Billy, is actually pretty mysterious in this one. He seems to be insane, and most interactions we see with him are during phone calls, as he first repeatedly calls the house and moans, which is why the girls give him the nickname the Moaner. He also sometimes mumbles half-coherent nonsense on some calls and repeatedly uses the name Agnes. The film implies he's killed before, but other than that, he's a full enigma. The director Bob Clark has given some backstory on the killer, saying that Billy murdered his parents on Christmas and locked his younger sister Agnes in the basement. Lord Summerisle, Wicker Man. Lord Summerisle is exactly that, the Lord of Summerisle, which is a mysterious island off the Scottish coast. The inhabitants of this island are pagans, and although they seem somewhat modern, they have strange and disturbing practices, such as putting toads in mouths to cure sore throats, public sex, even in front of children, and human sacrifice. Apparently, these traditions started with Lord Summerisle's grandfather, who developed strains of fruit trees that did well in the climate, and believed that the old gods would use the fruit to bring prosperity to the pagans. Part of this tradition involves human sacrifice. If the harvest goes badly one year, then the pagans must kill a human to ensure a bountiful harvest the following season. Lord Summerisle orchestrates all of this, which culminates culminates in the May Day celebration where they offer a sacrifice. Cropsey, the Burning. The Burning is often seen as a Friday the 13th ripoff, as a mysterious deformed figure kills off camp counselors, but it's since gained a cult following and is respected as a slasher in its own right. Cropsey was the alcoholic caretaker of Camp Blackfoot, but when a prank goes awry, Cropsey's cabin goes up in flames with him inside. He survives, but is horribly disfigured. 5 years later, he is released from the hospital and goes on a revenge mission against the camp. The most notable thing about Cropsey is his weapon of choice, a large pair of shears. There's a great scene when he slashes some teens in broad daylight, and we see that iconic shot of the shears held up in the sun. Interestingly enough, Cropsey actually comes from an old urban legend about an escaped mental patient who would come out at night and kidnap children. Turns out this wasn't a myth, and Cropsey turned out to be an actual serial killer, Andre Rand. The Organization, Cabin in the Woods. Major spoilers on this one, as Cabin in the Woods is one of those movies you just kind of need to watch, so just skip to the next entry if you want to avoid spoilers here. Cabin in the Woods starts off like a cliche horror movie with a group of young people spending the night in an old cabin before slowly being killed off. But the big twist is that this entire scenario is being monitored by a secret organization that serves the Ancient Ones, a race of deities that ruled Earth long before humans. Now they lie dormant under the surface and are kept at bay by ritualistic mass sacrifice. The organization utilizes a mass number of monsters created by the ancients in order to kill humans for the ritual. These monsters range from deranged hillbillies to supernatural entities, basically parodies of all the horror villains I've covered so far. The concept being that the organization creates these horror scenarios and lures humans into them, which then play out like some kind of horror movie, and the typical stereotypes you might see in a classic slasher film are actually part of the ritual, as the 5 archetypes, the athlete, the whore, the scholar, the fool, and the virgin, must be killed in the sacrifice. While we mostly see the American division of the organization, there are several other facilities around the world that also perform a ritual to increase their chances of keeping the ancients at bay. Asami Yamazaki, Audition. Audition is quintessential J-horror in my opinion, and I think Asami is up there when it comes to my favorite horror villains. Audition is about a widower, Shigeharu Oyama, whose friend, a film producer, creates a mock casting audition at which young women audition for the part of Oyama's new wife. He's immediately enchanted by a beautiful woman named Asami. So as it turns out, Asami is an absolute psycho hose beast who has a real thing for torture and murder. Eventually she captures Oyama and tortures him with needles, sticking them under his eyes and cutting off one of his feet with a wire saw. Oh yeah, and she also keeps a man in a sack in her apartment who's missing both feet, his tongue, one ear, and 3 fingers on one hand. At one point he crawls out of the sack and begs for food. Asami vomits into a dog dish and places it on the floor for the man. The man sticks his face into the vomit and hungrily consumes it. This chick is a freak, man. Well, the backstory is Asami was abused by her stepfather as a child and grew up despising men. She sleeps with them, and then if she senses even the slightest bit of betrayal, she kidnaps, tortures, and murders them. The lipstick-faced demon, Insidious. Also known as the red-faced demon, the man with fire on his face, and that one guy that kind of looks like Darth Maul, the demon is the main antagonist in Insidious 1 and Insidious the Red Door, but is featured in every movie in the franchise. The demon's origins are unclear, but we know he resides in and rules over a spirit world called the Further. He originally targets Dalton Lambert, a young boy, because of his supernatural abilities and spiritual energy, and traps him in the Further. Later, in the Red Door, he further pursues Dalton 9 years after the first film. The demon seems to have several supernatural abilities such as possession of people and objects, and has sharp claws which he sharpens in his lair in the Further. I think his lair is the most interesting part of the demon because he seems to have a slight interest in music which plays in his lair, and even drama, as the lair looks somewhat like an old theater and has marionettes that the demon plays with. Jimmy Bones. Jimmy Bones was originally a gangster in the late 70s, well respected by his community. However, when a corrupt cop and drug pusher try and get Jimmy into the trade, he refuses, wanting to protect his hood from drug circulation. After rejecting his proposal, the cop forces Jimmy's associates to betray and stab him to death. Now, 20 years later, the neighborhood is run down, full of criminals and drugs. 4 teens purchase Bones' residence in order to turn it into a nightclub. Meanwhile, the spiritual manifestation of Jimmy Bones returns in the form of a dog. This is likely referencing the fact that Bones is played by Snoop Dogg. Jimmy Bones is slowly resurrected into physical form to exact revenge on those who betrayed him, killing some of the teens along the way. He sort of resembles a Candyman-like figure to me, sort of ghostly, virtually immortal, and really strong. Of course, Bones has that Snoop Dogg flair, so there's some hilarious one-liners as well. Mademoiselle. Martyrs. Martyrs is considered one of the most brutal and disturbing films ever made. To get to Mademoiselle, it requires a little backstory. The film primarily follows two young women, Lucy and Anna. Lucy was horrifically tortured by unknown people in some kind of torture chamber, but managed to escape, ending up in an orphanage where she met Anna. Fast forward into adulthood, and Lucy has managed to find the people who held her captive, a seemingly normal family. She kills them all with a shotgun and calls Anna to tell her what she's done. Shortly after Anna shows up, Lucy dies, hallucinating a zombie-like woman that is actually the manifestation of her guilt for leaving another tortured woman behind when she originally escaped. She sees this entity killing her, but in reality she's doing this to herself. Out of nowhere, some kind of organized group of mysterious people show up, led by a woman known as Mademoiselle. Turns out that the parents of this seemingly normal family were part of a secret cult-like group that torture women to the point of martyrdom. Mademoiselle's goal is to one day torture someone to the point where they partially cross over to the other side and experience what is to come after death, revealing the secret to her and subsequently the other members of the group who have paid large amounts of money to gain this knowledge. They've tried this with many different people and even children, but have found that the most likely candidates seem to be young women. So now Anna becomes the next victim, and let me tell you, it is absolutely brutal what they do to her. Most notably, and probably one of the reasons people straight up walked out of the initial showings of this film, is when they skin her alive. They actually surgically remove all of the skin from her body besides her face. At this point, Anna actually does seem to experience something from the other side and whispers what she sees to Mademoiselle. We don't know what Anna whispers, and shortly after, as the large group of wealthy people show up to finally hear the news, Mademoiselle takes her own life. Definitely one of the most chilling endings in horror, and Mademoiselle is up there with the most evil for sure. The Bayfield Babyface Killer, Happy Death Day. Spoiler warning on this one, just a heads up if you want to skip ahead. The basic plot of Happy Death Day is that a college student, Tree Gelbman, is caught in a time loop, reliving the same day over and over, with each day ending in her death by the hands of the Babyface Killer, a person in all black wearing a giant baby mask. Originally, the killer was thought to be John Toombs, a serial killer who targets young blondes, but after Tree kills him, the death loop still resets, and it's later revealed that the true killer is Laurie Spengler, Tree's jealous roommate. Happy Toys Truck, Maximum Overdrive. Also known as the Green Goblin Truck, this Western Star 4800 truck with a giant cartoon Green Goblin on the front is the main villain in Maximum Overdrive and is the second killer vehicle on the list after Christine, which is also based on a Stephen King novel. Not much to say about this one. Basically, a strange comet passes by the Earth and machines begin coming to life and killing humans, with the film's focus being on this truck. Brightburn. Brightburn sort of asks the question, what if Superman was sent to conquer the Earth? It follows Brandon Bayer, a boy who looks completely human but is actually an alien. His parents found him in a field as a baby where his spacecraft landed in Brightburn, Kansas. As he ages, the boy begins showing a dark nature and his superpowers begin to develop. This escalates to the point where his adoptive parents are terrified and even try to kill him. However, this is the snapping point for Brandon, who kills his parents and begins going on a destructive rampage, causing mass media attention, who give him the nickname Brightburn based on the name of the town. B, the babysitter. B seems to be a stereotypical babysitter, but Cole, the boy she's babysitting, soon finds out that she is actually a Satanist who's made a deal with the devil to get whatever she wants. In return, she must offer the blood of the innocent. Using her babysitter gig as a way of finding fresh victims, she hopes to use Cole as a continuous source of blood and killing whoever she needs to in order to stay secret. The Sharps, Crimson Peak. Spoiler warning for this one, Thomas and Lucille Sharp are siblings, Thomas being an inventor seeking funding for his next big invention. However, the Sharps get money by conning rich women with no family. Thomas marries them, and then they slowly poison the woman to collect her wealth. In Crimson Peak, Edith is the new addition to this scheme. The Sharps begin to poison Edith as she slowly uncovers the truth, the biggest reveal being that the siblings have an incestuous relationship. Although Thomas seems to form true feelings for Edith and shows remorse for his actions, Lucille develops a jealous rage over Edith because she wants Thomas for herself. In the end, she kills her brother so that no one else can have him. Mark Lewis, Peeping Tom. Mark Lewis is an aspiring filmmaker and photographer who also happens to be a serial killer. He kills women and films their dying expressions so that he can pleasure himself to it later. Yeah, pretty dark stuff for 1960. Actually, this film was heavily criticized for its sex and violence at the time, so much so that it ruined director Michael Powell's career. However, the film has gone on to be a cult classic and is praised in retrospect. Mark has an interesting backstory that explains his strange obsession. When he was a child, his father used him as a test subject for psychological experiments on fear. His father would study his son's reaction to various situations conditions, filming the reactions, and constantly putting him under surveillance. Kind of reminds me of the Little Albert experiment I covered in my Human Experiments video. Victor Crowley, Hatchet. Victor Crowley is definitely an underrated horror villain in my opinion. He's the deformed hatchet-bearing freak killing all who enter his Louisiana swamp. The Hatchet films definitely don't take themselves too seriously and seem like a huge love letter to 80s slashers. Victor Crowley looks a lot like Jason Voorhees to me, specifically from part 2 because of the overalls, long disheveled hair, and of course that face that only a mother, or in this case father, could love. Interestingly enough, he's actually played by actor Caine, who played Jason in several of the films. The backstory is that Crowley's father, Thomas Crowley, had an affair with his dying wife's nurse, Lena. That's messed up. Well, his wife puts a curse on Lena before she dies, but Thomas and Lena continue to shack up after her death. Eventually, Lena becomes pregnant, but the child comes out horribly disfigured and Lena dies at the sight of him. Thomas lived on and cared for the child, who he named Victor, but kept him hidden from the world due to his deformity. Eventually, some kids in a cruel prank set their cabin on fire with Victor inside. Thomas arrives and while using a hatchet to break down the door, accidentally strikes his own son in the face, killing him. 10 years later, Thomas died and Victor resurrected as a vengeful spirit, killing anyone who enters his swamp. So there you go. Honestly, the best thing about Crowley is the absolute gnarly ways he kills his victims, which are almost always done with beautiful, gory practical effects. Judas Iscariot, Dracula 2000. In one of the most unique takes on Dracula I've seen, Dracula is revealed in this movie to actually be Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus to the Romans in return for 30 pieces of silver. Afterwards, he felt such remorse that he attempted to hang himself, but the rope snapped and he found himself to be cursed as a vampire. This explains why he's resistant to Christian icons like the cross and repelled by silver because of the silver coins he was paid. Like I said, pretty interesting take on the character. Sam Harper, Uncle Sam. So this is really a horror movie where a zombie Uncle Sam goes on a killing spree. It begins when Master Sergeant Sam Harper is killed in a helicopter crash caused by friendly fire in Kuwait. His body is sent back home to his family but springs to life on the 4th of July. He kills a man in an Uncle Sam outfit, dons it, and goes on a rampage, killing teenagers who desecrate a grave and burn the flag, and then publicly executing a corrupt politician. It's later revealed that Sam Harper was a horrible abuser and alcoholic who only joined the military so he could kill people. What a bizarre moment in cinematic history. Max 3000, man's best friend. Our second killer dog on the iceberg behind Cujo, Max is a genetically modified Tibetan Mastiff engineered to have enhanced strength and speed, along with violent tendencies. Animal activist and TV host Lori Tanner frees Max from Emax Labs, a facility that's attempting to genetically engineer animals and use them as weapons. Lori adopts Max unaware that his DNA is altered, and the dog soon goes on a killing spree. My favorite part of this movie is when Max swallows a cat whole. Now that's funny. Ricky Chapman, Silent Night, Deadly Night 2. This one follows the same basic premise as the first movie, but is somehow way goofier. And I won't lie, I'm glad it's on here just to mention everyone's favorite scene, when the main character finally snaps and goes on a killing spree, culminating in one of the best lines in movie history.
Garbage day! Huh? No!
Death Angels, A Quiet Place. The Death Angels are alien creatures that came to Earth on a meteorite and began to kill anything that makes a sound, killing off most of humanity. According to writer and director John Krasinski, the aliens come from a lightless planet in another galaxy that has extremely harsh conditions and high gravity. Because of this environment, they developed a hypersensitivity to sound and use echolocation to navigate. They're extremely strong and fast, gaining speeds up to 300 miles an hour, and have a tough skin that's resistant to most conventional weapons. Their only weakness is actually their greatest strength, as their sensitive ears can cause them pain from high-pitched noises. The Death Angels are beasts lacking any real intelligence, and strangely enough, they don't kill humans for food, but rather lash out at anything that makes a noise. Jack, The House That Jack Built. This is another movie that is considered one of the most disturbing films ever made. It follows a serial killer, Jack, who murdered dozens of people throughout the 70s and 80s. The film is structured like Dante's Inferno, as the Roman poet Virgil leads Jack through the 9 circles of hell, and Jack recounts his crimes in flashbacks. And let me tell you, these are pretty gnarly. In one incident, Jack cuts off his girlfriend's breasts, making one of them into a wallet, and in one of the most disturbing scenes in film, Jack is dating a woman with 2 sons. He takes them on a hunting trip and seems to be a charming father figure, that is until he shoots the 2 kids in front of their mother like he's hunting deer and then kills the mother as well. Pretty shocking, because usually these movies stray away from murdering kids, but nope, this one is brutal. That's not even the half of it, but you get the idea. Jack is vicious, but don't worry, he literally goes to hell. Marry Elnor, The Unholy. Mary Elnor was originally accused of witchcraft in the 1800s. She's donned with a metal mask that is hammered into her face and hanged. However, her ashes are kept in a creepy-ass Kern doll. Fast forward to the modern day, and journalist Jerry Finn breaks the doll in order to make up a creepy story about it. What he doesn't realize is he just released Mary's soul. Shortly after this, supernatural occurrences begin happening in the area, including a young deaf-mute girl, Alice, miraculously speaking, claiming to be cured by the Virgin Mary. Turns out, of course, that this entity Alice believes to be the Virgin Mary is none other than Mary Elnor. Mary wasn't exactly a witch per se, but she did sell her soul to Satan in order to gain power, which has made her an undying entity. Alice is actually Mary's descendant, and Mary begins using her to gain more followers, making Mary stronger and subsequently gaining more souls for the devil. Asa Vajda, Black Sunday. Asa Vajda is a 17th century witch and vampire who's sentenced to death. Before she's killed, she's donned with a metal mask that is hammered into her face. Fast forward to modern day, and two traveling doctors accidentally disturb her tomb, resurrecting her where she continues her sinister plans, including draining the life force of her descendant. Sound familiar? Yeah, the basic premise, especially the opening of this movie, is almost the exact same as the Unholy. It's weird too, because I can't find any reference to it being like a semi-remake or anything. It's not mentioned on either of the Wikipedia pages, but it can't be a coincidence, can it? I can understand a witch being hanged and coming back, but the metal mask is way too specific. Edward Carver, The Poughkeepsie Tapes. The Poughkeepsie Tapes is presented as a documentary piecing together the crimes of a serial killer known as the Poughkeepsie Killer, aka Edward Carver, through a collection of tapes found in an abandoned house in Poughkeepsie, New York. The story is a disturbing chronicle of Carver's decades-long spree, with tapes revealing his methods of abduction, torture, and murder. The film combines interviews and fictional law enforcement, victims' families, and forensic experts alongside the footage from the killer's tapes. A particularly creepy aspect of the story is the killer's manipulation and prolonged torment of one of the surviving victims, Cheryl Dempsey. While there are a lot of standout scenes in the movie that are really terrifying, it's really the way Carver interacts with Cheryl that is the most disturbing part to me. The killer often wears masks and strange outfits, and he eventually makes Cheryl wear a mask as well. He makes her call herself slave, and she eventually becomes completely submissive to him. Pretty dark stuff. Anaconda. Yep, this is the massive snake that begins picking off a documentary film crew and hunter in the Amazon rainforest. These days, giant killer animals are usually reserved for on-demand sci-fi channel movies, but there was a sliver of time where movies like Anaconda were pretty mainstream. Not much more to say about this one. It's a big snake that eats people. Bill Roberts, Intruder. The premise of Intruder is that a department store is being sold, and we follow the overnight staff as they mark down all the inventory. But an intruder gets into the store and begins killing everyone. Turns out it's Bill Roberts, one of the store's owners. Upset that his partner was going to sell the store, he kills him, but goes mad and begins killing the staff as well. It's a fun little flick with some really cool supermarket-inspired kills and effects, like a guy being crushed in a cardboard baler or a dude getting his head cut in half by a meat slicer. Plus, we see some cameos of Sam and Ted Raimi, who are both killed on screen. Felix Davison, You're Next. Some spoilers here. The Davison family are getting together at their vacation home for a family reunion, and everything seems all sunshine and rainbows until several masked killers show up and begin killing everyone off. Felix Davison, one of the young sons of the family, is not any of the masked killers. However, it is revealed that he and his girlfriend hired them to assassinate the rest of the family in order to gain their inheritance. Joseph, Creep. Creep follows Aaron, a videographer who answers a Craigslist ad to film a man named Joseph for a day. Joseph claims he wants to make a video diary for his unborn son because he has an inoperable brain tumor. As the day progresses, Joseph's behavior becomes increasingly strange and unsettling. Aaron discovers that Joseph's stories are fabrications, leading to a tense game of cat and mouse. The film takes a pretty simple approach, focusing only on these two characters and their interactions. There's also a bit of humor to it, as Joseph is such a quirky guy, and I actually think that plays into the horror a lot. Well, it's a spoiler, but I think it's kind of obvious where this is all leading, and it's necessary to explain the sequel, but Joseph is actually a killer and made everything up in order to lure Aaron to him as another victim. Creep 2 picks up directly after the first film, this time following Sarah, an artist and YouTuber who creates videos about lonely men. She responds to an ad posted by Joseph, who's now calling himself Aaron, who confesses he is a serial killer and proposes she document his life for 24 hours. Intrigued and skeptical, Sarah accepts. Apparently, the writer, Mark Duplass, who actually plays Joseph, ultimately wants to do a trilogy, although it's unclear when or if the third film will ever get made. Leslie Vernon, Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. Behind the Mask is a mockumentary that follows a serial killer. Although this film is set in a world where famous movie slashers like Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and Michael Myers are real, and a new aspiring killer, Leslie Vernon, aims to join the ranks. The story follows a documentary film crew who are invited to document the preparations of Leslie Vernon as he plans to become the next great serial killer. Leslie's actually very likable. He takes the crew through his rigorous training regimen, his selection of weapons, and his meticulous planning to create his own horrifying legend. It's a great comedic angle as there are countless jokes to be had at the tropes of slasher films. While it starts as a seemingly lighthearted and satirical look at the conventions of horror films, it quickly becomes a slasher in its own right when the crew is forced to confront the moral implications of their project as Leslie's plan to stage a massacre in an abandoned house becomes a reality. Gage Creed, Pet Cemetery. Okay, let's add another killer kid to the list. Gage is the young son of the Creed family. After he's hit by a truck and killed, his father uses an ancient Native American burial ground to bring him back to life. Unfortunately, he isn't the sweet little boy he was before and instantly goes on a killing spree. The Grabber, the Black Phone. The Grabber is actually pretty mysterious. All we really know is that he abducts and kills children, targeting boys. He wears an all-black outfit with a black top hat and red turtleneck underneath his shirt. The only notable aspects of the Grabber is that he loves masks, having several masks that express different emotions, and that he loves to toy with his victims. For example, leaving the basement door unlocked only to wait and punish any victim who attempts to leave. The Apeth, his house. His house follows Bol and Riel, two refugees from South Sudan who attempt to start a new life in Britain. However, an evil presence begins manifesting in the house, which Riel calls an Apeth or Night Witch. The Apeths typically haunt someone who has stolen something from them. I don't want to give away too much since this is a recent movie, but the Apeth eventually fully manifests, and I have to say, it's one of the creepiest horror creatures I've seen in a while. Bravo on the design and makeup here. Gabriel, Malignant. No way to avoid spoilers on this one, so fair warning. Malignant follows Madison, an average woman who has failed to conceive a child for several years. After a fight with her husband Derek, where he bashes her head against a wall, Derek is mysteriously killed. Shortly after, Madison begins having visions of murders, which are actually happening. So this is a wild one, but Madison was actually born Emily, and as a child she had a parasitic malformed twin protruding out of her back. This is Gabriel. Because of his bleak existence, Gabriel developed violent tendencies, lashing out and killing several doctors. Finally, the doctors decide it's best to excise Gabriel from Emily, surgically removing his body. His face, however, was left behind as it was too dangerous to remove. 28 years later, adult Emily, aka Madison, hits her head during the fight with her husband, which reawakens Gabriel. He now possesses her body in order to commit murders in an act of revenge. I have to say, the reveal of Gabriel coming out of Emily's back as a kid is absolutely horrifying and one of the most disturbing effects I've seen in a while. There's also some badass action sequences where Gabriel uses Madison's body and just straight up John Wick style starts wasting dudes. I mean, I can't say I expected that, but it was pretty cool. The Wendigo. Antlers. The Wendigo varies as many folklore creatures do, but we'll obviously be focusing specifically on the Wendigo as it appears in this movie. Here the Wendigo survives by taking on different human hosts and relies on large amounts of food to survive. It's pretty horrifying watching the Wendigo transform from human to hulking creature as its antlers tear out of its host's body. And the creature itself is a true terror, especially when it still has the human face attached. Okay, another one bites the dust. There are 3 tiers left on this berg, and they're actually a lot smaller, which is pretty typical for an iceberg chart, so I'm hoping to put the last 3 tiers in just 1 or 2 more videos. Sorry again for the delay in uploads. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but typically in the summer, I just have a lot going on in my personal life that makes it a little harder to crank out videos at my usual rate, so thanks again everyone for the patience. If you want to support the channel, consider joining my Patreon, where you'll get a shout out at the end of every video, as well as bonus content. Speaking of which, I want to thank my friends on Patreon: Naomi Romero, Soma, Krusty the Crab, One Group, Laz Wishgender, Glimmering Haster, Hunter Piva, Heather M, Creepypasta Cube, A Slightly Bigger Ant, Ricky Shadow, Chase Middleton, Strong Kohi, Matt Rozak, Glenn Bridges, Steamboat Millie, The Beast Llama, Holy Ears, Nat 007, and Andrew Valencia. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you want a shout out just like that, consider becoming a patron. The link is below. But I appreciate you guys watching at all, so thank you. This is Grief speaking. Goodbye, friends.